لحظة عبد الله مكي في مداخلتك بالنسبة للجلسة.
Mr. Abdullah Makki, your intervention with regards to the third session. In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate. First of all, I will comment on the paper on security and military action and the approach of the Islamic movement towards these aspects. Before that, they used not to talk, they refrained from talking about those military aspects as though they were ashamed of them. But over 30 years, they undertook security undertakings and missions that were huge. So we cannot hide from that. Mr. Abdullah, could you please get closer to the microphone because the voice is not so clear. So the Islamic movement went through 3 stages. First of all, until 1976, we had what we used to call the information offices related to the members and the individuals, and it was affected by the Egyptian experience and their experience with the state, with its relation with the Muslim Brotherhood and its crushing down on Muslim Brotherhood. I actually met Mr. Abdullah Hassan Ahmad, and when he said all the movement rejected any involvement with arms unanimously, actually they had 1 rifle from World War II. That was the even that rifle was dispensed in the sea at the time. Then in 1976, there were dozens or hundreds, and then hundreds of thousands of rifles or of so what kind of shift was that from throwing the only rifle you had to taking up hundreds of thousands? In the same book, there was reference to most major security theories, and he said that the real importance, the real security solution for the movement was to spread across all localities, neighborhoods, etc. And then at the next stage, we had the war with Darfur and the rebellion. And in this stage, we had a paper on security and political and social security issues. It was secret at the time, but it was published later. In this paper in 1984, Turabi talked about security and about even the manufacturing of weapons in order to stop any advent from the West or by the West. As for the government of salvation, most Islamists tend to be apologetic or try to justify. But let's say that the use of military power is one of the tools and means of statehood. All of those issues were a part of an overall strategy and a system when they took power. The government of salvation has to be studied because it established a full-fledged security apparatus, and the Islamic movement provided its resources and its qualified resources for the service of that apparatus. So Sudan was under direct attack, with also internal pressures from the opposition, with the embassies, with external pressures. In that context, they were able to use the security apparatus and the community security as well. After the Gulf War, there was a strategy to secure the movement based on self-defense and also based on agriculture and making use of the revenues of oil. As for the training, it was for all Sudanese, not only for the Islamic movement members. One of the theories also, what I'm trying to say is that the Islamic movement was able to secure the state under those conditions, and the Islamic movements are still stuck with the questions that can we take power by coups, by a coup, or etc., while they are in detention and under arrest and under torture and under restriction. So I believe that we have the theories of Hassan al-Turabi and we have what happened in practice, all of which need to be studied alongside one another. How can we strike the balance between the freedom? Mr. Abdullah, the sound is interrupted. I'm not sure what the problem is. If you could get closer to the microphone, please, and keep it to 2 minutes. So how do you strike a balance in between unity and freedom, between control and totalitarianism? It's not so that either I be in detention or I detain the other. There has to be a balance. The Islamic movement is the only one that is qualified for taking up power since they established the security, etc. But when Hassan al-Turabi talked about this, he didn't mean that we attack others, but that we be prepared to defend ourselves and to defend our country. And even when he talked about the Islamic movement, this was connected to it's a movement that does not antagonize democracy, nor does it totally adopt it. But after this experience, we have to re-examine those values of freedom and other values upheld by the Islamic movement in order to assess the experience fully and look at it from the different aspects.
عليكم السلام. شكرا جزيلا
Thank you
لك.
so much.
هل في مداخلة أخرى؟
Is there any other comment? Here in Istanbul, would anyone like to comment?
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والحقيقة
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Actually, if there is time, I think we need to recognize the nature of the relation between the security apparatuses in Sudan and whether the official apparatuses or those established by the government of salvation, because that would clarify what happened at the end and how this understanding, mutual understanding, sort of collapsed and led to the meltdown in 2019. So at least we have to recognize the existing relations between security forces, which have to, or which are supposed to be declared. Oh no, not really. There's no sound.
يا دكتور المتحدث ده صوته ما واضح عندنا. انت برضه ما سامعنا.
تمام. بسم الله بسم الله بسم الله.
بسم الله. Can you hear me now?
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أنا شايف
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. I believe that there is much focus on
اليوم وقبل اليوم إنها تجربة الحركة الإسلامية.
Focusing on this experience as the experience of the Islamic movement. Can this experience be said to be the experience of all of the Islamic movement in Sudan or part of the Islamic movement in Sudan? I believe this should have been in the definitions before we started this discussion, because I believe this experience is more specific than to be attributed to the Islamic movement as a whole, and also the overall good value. We lost this voice again.
صوت مقطوع من عندنا يا دكتور.
بعض الزملاء والانتقال السريع إلى الأممية في تجربة الحركة الإسلامية في السودان.
In the experience of the Islamic movement in Sudan, although it was clear for the movement particularly, but for the founder, Mr. Hassan al-Turabi, that he refused the idea of an global or an international organization. So how can this be the case, and then not take this into consideration when evaluating this experience? The other important issue, we lost him again. The other important issue is that the experience of governance in Sudan, despite all the challenges and obstacles and the dilemmas that no other Islamic movement had to deal with, and reached some solutions that superseded or surpassed many other intellectuals or theorists, but it failed to find a formula in which to renew the regime or the system of governance, and to enhance its chances at continuation, particularly in the last 10 years, where the regime had a chance of renewing itself and succeeding. And had it succeeded, it may have been able to manage to continue its experience. It would have been, in this case, the longest and the best and the pioneering, model.
الوضع الآن بيتغير.
The situation since the 90s with the unipolar world order, the conditions were more conducive for them to renew the system in a way that would sustain itself for longer. I would have loved to hear some of the people who come from different backgrounds, particularly leftist background, especially to hear some critical views. And this is important for all Islamic movements, not only when they take power, but particularly when they take power, because they need to see how they are regarded in their rivals' eyes. And I believe that the best evaluation would be through the eyes of the rivals, particularly the leftists in the case of Sudan.
بعض النقاط التي طرحها الدكتور طارق.
Some of the issues posed by Dr. Tariq would be taken up by the organizers, myself that is, for ourselves, and some are related to the speakers, and they would be given the chance to comment. In terms of the standards, of course, this event, which is not only concerned with Sudan, it starts in Sudan, but we are going to review a further 25 experiences. We didn't want to establish standards for evaluation because they may differ from one person to another. We left this for the people who prepared those papers, or they outlined those papers. Of course, this is just the beginning. It's important to start this review or evaluation, and there will be many meetings for each experience, because each experience is wealthy and rich, that needs much consideration. But we wanted to get started, and we didn't want to standardize this, but to give the freedom for the speakers and those who wrote up those papers. The other question depends on who we invite, and that is our responsibility, and that's not their responsibility. And we didn't want to get people from different backgrounds, so that not to take the discussion to a different level from what we wanted to hear, which is to hear the people who were involved in this experience, or who lived through this experience. So after probably we finish this internal discussion of those involved in this experience, we might invite those who are critical or rivals. This is not related to the speakers themselves. This is our responsibility, of course. Are there any further comments before we go into our fourth session? Yes, we're still in the previous session, actually. Dr. Idris, go ahead, please.
Bismillahir
Rahmanir Rahim. First of all, the first point in relation to the first paper, or the first presentation in relation to Islamists and the security institution. I liked the person who said that the Islamists used one attempt and were able to get to power in the first military coup in a country that's full of military coups. And some of them said that some of the reasons why they left or they were toppled was because the situation was similar to that in 1989. And also there is another thing in relation to the Sudanese experience, because it is the only experience in which the Islamist movement came to power through a military coup. So, this experience is worth considering, and we also noticed that they were preemptive in their coup because they thought at the time they had the Baathists or nationalists who would have staged a military coup had the Islamists not staged their own. And we don't have this in the Arab Maghreb, but it looks like the nationalists and the Baathists in Egypt and elsewhere in Iraq and Syria want the east of the Arab world to be purely nationalist, and their attempts ended up with colonialism, actually. So it is important to reach a point where we reach an agreement with the nationalist party when very often their discourse is cooperative, but when we go into actual practice, such as in Sudan, there is much rivalry and anti-Unionization. The other issue in relation to separation, what I noticed is that Sudan was the victim of two currents: the nationalists in the nationalist Arab in the north and the Pan-African in the south. And this is the first time I hear that this sentiment reaches a point that threatens the integrity of the territory of an Arab state such as Sudan, which is an African Arab state. And of course, there was a negligence of the South, and the focus was mostly on the North, and but only, except for the 10 years of prosperity, like the example offered on the Juba University. But I would tend to believe that it's not so much a Pan-African sentiment as much as a Western impact that exploited this lack of development in the South to instill division. Thank you so much, Mr. Idris. Any other comments? Bismillah. I'd like to salute Dr. Adel Hassan. In terms of the security action or security institution, it is a vital factor for the success or failure of any political action or any political entity. I have some questions, and probably we can also refer some of those to the lessons learned section. There are many successes by the security apparatus under the Islamic movement because it did not follow a familiar or a traditional approach. It started with introducing due process and also having qualification and education on security, and we had researchers, etc. So much so that those who worked for the security apparatus were not only security personnel, but also all the diplomats and many of the high-profile officials had security training as well, and this gave the security apparatus much responsibility, but at the same time expanded its impact and influence. So would you say that this expansion of its influence was something that made it get out of control, and also for other Islamic movements who want to make use of this experience. You talked about successes such as protection, weapon or arms industry, or manufacturing, dealing with security threats, but there were issues that the movement was unique in its approach to them. For example, how they confronted the issue of labor unionist work, and in a country where there is much unionist action and much political awareness, and how those this security apparatus was able to accommodate for those under the state without any security threats.
وهنالك عمل أمني خارجي
Also,
كبير.
in relation to the neighboring countries, Sudan is bordered by 8 neighboring countries, and there is a lot of security work to be taken. And also, he referred, or he didn't actually, refer to the failures. He said there are some failures, but he didn't elaborate where the Islamic movement partially or totally failed. He didn't talk about this, but people may hear some of the failures that were very clear and evident. So it is important to evaluate those failures from within. One of the most important thing is the extent of compliance with the law in a crisis, in the containment of crises, and also the centers of strength. If we talk about the security academy, the successes of the security apparatus, the expansion of the security apparatus, do you believe that this expansive role made the security apparatus act in a capacity beyond its own capacity and become a security threat of its own right? The other issue in relation to the South, the issue of the South is similar to issues that face the Islamic movement in many other states in the Arab and Islamic world. And this issue of minorities or of diversity, has the Islamic movement introduced any vision for them in Islamic states? Was the separation of the South part of the vision of the Islamic movement, or was it a de facto development that happened through political development and dialogue and agreements? So is it better for us to separate from those minorities and coexist with them, or do we take up arms or negotiate and have political solutions? Is it in the best interest of the Islamic movement to introduce some conceptualization and previsions for those questions? There are many such questions. The Kurds, the Amazigh, all Arab states, and even in in Pakistan and other Islamic states, one of the lessons learned, then I believe, is that we have to preempt any attempt to change or any attempt to take power partly or totally, to try to have a vision for those enclaves.
شكرا جزيلا لك. نكتفي بهذا القدر، والآن نعطي الفرصة للإخوة المحاضرين أن يعلقوا على التعليقات، ونبدأ بالدكتور عادل حسن.
Let's start with Dr. Adel Hassan in Al-Khartoum. One of the questions was, what are the failures that you mentioned without elaborating upon them?
التي تراها كانت استراتيجية. ما هي هذه؟
At least in strategic terms, what were those failures?
ثم بعد ذلك
And
الأخ
then after that, Dr. Walid Al-Tayyib, you may comment on what you heard, and then we move to Dr. Huwaida, then we conclude this session and move to the fourth session. Thank you so much. I thank all the colleagues who commented, and also I commend Engineer Khaled and all our friends who provided some questions in relation to my paper. As for the failures, there are many, one of which was the military control of the political arena, which had implications not only for the Islamic movement, but for Sudan as a whole, particularly that there were many discrepancies and disagreements within the Islamic movement, which caused to the fragmentation of this movement, especially between the Secretary General and the President, and then also the long period of control with the same leadership. Of course, so very briefly, I could summarize it summarize the failure as being the militarization of the political action or political work in Sudan. But also there is the prolonged war in the south, which was an obstacle to development. And if those questions were addressed since the beginning, we would have saved a lot of lives, and we would have progressed better in the course of development. And also, as Mr. Khaled mentioned, those institutions were started to be involved in issues that were at the heart of the mission of other ministries, for example, education. So while some budget was allocated to security education, it could have been allocated for higher education. The same applies also to healthcare, and also it competed with other economic sectors on the same resources. And sometimes it was also clear that the military took control of institutions that would have acted better as independent. For example, some sovereign ministers or ministries would not have enough independence to be able to act properly. So the reduction of the political action in the person of one individual. So at the end of the day, this ultimately weakened the institutions, and decisions were made by single individuals.
ويمكن نقطة ضعف لدولة مثل السودان تتمتع بحدود طويلة جدا في وجود إمكانيات يعني محدودة.
Given that Sudan, there were some initiatives, for example, to introduce joint military units, which was not just required in Sudan only, but also required international support to fend off some cross-border threats such as human trafficking, drug trade, and other threats to international peace and security. And in terms of the unionist action, of course, although there wasn't enough freedom to elect the unionist leaders, but there was an international effort to exploit this fissure. The Islamic movement should have better addressed those questions, particularly, and take it up also with the nationalist party. You also mentioned the
وجهة نظر معادية مقاربة صحيح قد يكون
listening to the point of view of that is critical of the Islamic movement, and I believe he's right. Actually, not only those who were rivals, but also who were within the ranks of the Islamic movement. Many of the members of the Islamic movement were marginalized and would have critical views of their actions.
Thank you, Dr. Adel. Now we move to Mr. Tayyib.
دكتور وليد غير موجود.
غير موجود. طيب ننتقل إلى الدكتورة هويدا. تسمعينا؟
Okay, we go now to Dr. Huwaida. Is she there? Okay, she's not there. Okay, thank you very much, everyone, for in the third session. Now we will move to the fourth session, which is under the title Lessons Learned and Forward-Looking for the Future. And we will have four papers. The first one will be about the division within the Islamic movement, reasons and the consequences thereof. As we said, this is an internal dialogue. Dr. Nagwa, she is a lecturer in the family development in the University of Technology. She was a coordinator for work and business incubator, and she got her PhD from the Sudan University of Technology and Sciences. She was a member of the Organization of Female Muslims, and she was the Secretary General. She established the Center for Women Studies in 1994, and she was the head of that center. She has many TV shows and books. The second paper will be for Dr. Abdel. It will be under the title Initiatives of Reform Within the Islamic Movement. Fath-Al'aleem is a researcher in the Islamic thought in the Sudan Center for Strategic Studies. He was a graduate of Durman Islamic University in law and Sharia, and he has several writings in philosophy, Islamic thought, and the jurisprudence of language. And he is a member of the Muslim Jurisprudence Council, member of the Sudanese Writers, and he also a member of the Center for the Studies of Women. And he has several books, including the Renewal theory in the thought of Al-Turabi, and he also worked had other works on interpretation and Islam and Sudan, a new vision. The third paper is about the future of the Islamic movement, with an evaluation of the Salvation Government. It will be provided by Dr. Hisham Ahmad Shamsuddin. He is member of the National Movement for Building and Development, and he is a researcher in the theory of knowledge. He is a producer in Al Jazeera and another media organizations in writing scenarios. Actually, the third one is for Dr. Hisham, Mr. Hisham Shawwani, not Hisham Shamsuddin. I'm sorry. There are two Hishams. So Hisham Shawwani is the one who will speak about the evaluation of the salvation experience and the future of the Islamic movement amongst the he is one of the youth movement in Sudan, one of the activists, and he is also one of the people in who revolted in 2018. He was in opposition of the Salvation government, and he is also a writer and a thinker about Sudan, and he writes articles on social media and in newspapers. He was a member in the popular Congress party when he was in university. Then he became member of the independent revolutionary movement after the Arab Spring, and he wrote about the cultural issues that caused the changes in his thought, and he also observed the changes that happened in the Arab world after the Arab Spring, and after his, despite his participation in the December revolution, he became one of the people quickly who criticized it, and it's criticized the changes that took place in that. His work and his experience is in the electrical engineering, but after graduation he became interested in the sociology, so he studied sociology and anthropology, and he represents himself as one of the members of the Islamic movement in Sudan and in the current of the youth in the movement. And the fourth one is about the lessons learned about the Islamic movement, and this is the Dr. Hisham. He is a researcher in the knowledge theory. He works in Al Jazeera as a producer, and he provides training in scenario writing for Al Jazeera and for other media issues, and he provides lectures in media issues, and he works in the cultural group for the renovation or resurrection of culture in Sudan and other groups. We will try to give each speaker 20 minutes in order to leave a space for commentators and for discussion, because we have two commentators after the papers. We will start with Dr. Najwa Abdul Latif. The floor is yours.
يا دكتور
دكتور
ليش لو سمحت يا دكتور
سامي.
نعم اسمعك.
انا معاك هويدا، دكتوره هويدا.
هويدا اهلا وسهلا.
انا
دكتور هويدا.
انا كنت بتكلم لكن انتوا ما سامعيني.
I was speaking but you were not hearing me. We were looking for you. I can do a quick intervention. Okay, and then we will move to Dr. Najwa. You have 5 minutes.
أنا حقيقة يعني هو يتكلم عن الحلول.
The speaker or the commentator, he was talking about the solutions that can be provided by the Islamic movement or the government at the time, and he spoke about the minorities. I don't know what, I'm not going to talk about the minorities, but I was speaking about the South. We can't call it a minority if unless he is speaking about the religious minority. If he is speaking about that, yes, because there was a project presented by the Islamic movement how to deal with the religious minorities. But it's difficult to say that the problem of the South or talk about them as they are a minority. The problem of the South was the separation and not for being a minority. We always suggested to sponsor the local cultures and the culture national legacy because this enrich the legacy or the heritage of Sudan in general, and drafting the constitution in a way that can represent all the components and take care of the ethnic and religious diversity, as well as the culture of peace and peace and the trust building. All of these issues can be forward-looking principles to raise awareness and not to hide information, and open think tanks, research centers, All of these issues can be things to be done in the future to be able to solve the problems that arise. That's all from my side. Thank you very much.
شكرا جزيلا لك.
Thank you very much. I also received a comment on the issue of the security services, and it says that the security service were successful in protecting the country, but there were some negative aspects, like, for example, getting into investment and businesses, and they started to compete the businesses in the market, because, and this is not fair, because all of the markets or all of the work in the market were taken by the security, and they were also given exemptions in the high ranking positions at the cost of members of the party and the Islamic movement, and it is also very cruel against the opponents, and also during the salvation it contributed to arresting some businessmen and some people who were accused of corruption. Now we start with the fourth session with the paper of Dr. Nagwa Abdul Latif. The floor is yours. In the name of God, all the blessings and prayers be upon His Messenger Muhammad. Thanks for the organizers, for the attendees, and the speakers of the papers. My paper, as Dr. said, is speaking about the division within the Islamic movement in Sudan. But I would like to ask you to use another word other than the division. Well, I have three. The word is al-mufasala, which is the same meaning but with a different word. So I am, instead of the word division, I'm going to use the word mufasala, which is the break up within the movement, and I have three justifications for that. The first reason is that because of the different issues that happen. The second word is the division is something that is, or the word break. Or the division is something that happens in one point of the time. The breakup is a cumulative and it takes time to happen, and that's why I'm using it. And the first reason was because this is a word that is most common now in Sudan. The third reason is that some people use the word defection, and but when we say defection, it leads to fragmentation, and sometimes it leads to the disappearance of both the fragments. For God forbid, this will not happen to the Islamic movement. The Islamic movement, maybe it has some problems, but it will never disappear. And even the other breakups that happened in the past, it continued to work. So I'm going to use the word breakup instead of division, and I hope that this will be acceptable by the organizers. The Islamic movement, if we go back to its history, of course, in my paper, I didn't have a historic methodology in it, or a historic approach. But I just want to speak about several points that happened in history, especially that they are available in all of the literature that spoke about the period, because there were several defections and disputes that happened about the Islamic movement, and a lot of disturbances that took place, like the attempt of Rashid al-Tahir and the attempts that happened in the 1977 after the reconciliation with the Numayri regime. All of these disputes that took place within the Islamic movement led to divisions within the Islamic movement. But the last incident, which is the breakup, The break-up led to having the National Congress divided into two congresses. One of them is the Popular Congress, and the other one is the National Popular Congress. This breakup that was mentioned by Sheikh Al-Turabi, may he rest in peace, when he said, wash your hands and let's pray. Of course, this, although there were some problems and there were injuries and loss of souls, but in general, that breakup was to a large extent, it was peaceful and it didn't lead to a lot of bloodshed or a lot of battles. I'm not going to speak about the history of the Islamic movement, but there are 6 features or characteristics about the Islamic movement that distinguish it from other movements in the world. I'm going to speak about them that are related to the matter that I'm going to speak about, which is the breakup. The Islamic movement was a lobby that was against the leftist approaches. The second characteristic is that the Islamic movement is always built on being dynamic and not static. So it changes its programs and the projects and actions, and it moved from the theory to the wider action, then to government. What distinguished also the Islamic movement, this dynamic that it has made this breakup less harmful, and it appeared as maybe some kind of the dynamism of the Islamic movement and not a problem within the Islamic movement.
المؤتمر الشعبي كحزب معارض تعاملوا مع الساحه نوع من انواع الانتقال، وحتى الصعيد الاخر اللي هو المؤتمر الوطني في انفتاحه مع
So those two parties that came up out of the Islamic movement, they were dealing in together with the community. The fourth characteristic is that this Islamic movement has 2 features. The first is that it benefited from the local Sudanese culture. It might be one of the local culture maybe was more inclined to the bloody cruelty. So if we go back to history, we find that when the Islamic movement came into Sudan, it wasn't part of the international movement. The other one, or the other characteristic, is that the leadership of the Islamic movement had influence on the leadership inside Sudan and outside Sudan. They were charismatic. For example, Sheikh Hassan, he was charismatic, and it had influence on the movement itself. Also, the Islamic movement, since it started working in Sudan, it strategized about the future, and it's a plan for the future. I believe that planning, not only in Sudan, in all of the world, there is a problem in planning. And the planning in these countries is different from a planning in the advanced countries. So in Sudan, planning has a lot of problems, because planning is some kind of looking at the others to plan and prepare ourselves for the future. Nevertheless, the Islamic movement may deviate from the plan that is set, but usually they were always following plans that they prepare beforehand. The fifth characteristic is that the Islamic movement It has a spiritual bond that links the members together. Of course, they are linked together through Quran and through religion, and they are all under the umbrella of there is no God worthy of worship but Allah. So these were one of the some of the aspects or the characteristics that were distinguishing the Islamic movement. Of course, they have Islamic terms of reference, religious terms of reference, and spiritual terms of reference. So they were not based on materialistic terms of reference. Of course, there were some changes here and there, but that was the basic thing. Also, the Islamic movement didn't focus on religion alone. Some of the statements that At-Turabi said was to maintain the value of a human being, and that the strategic plan for the Islamic movement is that not to have Islam retreat and not to have Sudan fragmented. This was one of the things that had disputes and differences, and some people said that this was not important, and that's why the separation of the South was expected by some people. And so even historically, the Islamic movement issued a paper in which it spoke about the importance of maintaining a unified Sudan and decentralized. This document, it was before the Islamic movement went or took power. So if people look at that document, even the enemies of the Islamic movement even the enemies of the movement says that this was one of the most precise paper. So some people recommended or commended this document, and that document was speaking that Sudan should be unified with all of its diverse ethnicities and religious groups, ethnic and religious groups. I'm not going to get into details of the paper, but we have a question. Why the Islamic movement used force to get into authority? I have four justifications. First is that the Islamic movement worked a lot before 1989. There was openness towards the society, and it helped and contributed to create the political entity in Sudan. So this was a credit for the Islamic movement. And what made the Islamic movement, as the previous speakers said, is that it rose to the surface, and there were a number of Islamic movements or Islamic groups that wants to get involved or to control the police or the army.
قائم في تداول السلطه على التداول الشوري والتداول بتاع الحريات للسلطه بعيدا عن القوه يعني. لكن الغريب في الموضوع انا في اثناء القراءه على
after I learned or read this literature in that topic, I read something that Al-Shanqiti wrote, regardless how much I agree or disagree with him. But he said that the National Salvation Revolution made a historic change because it's the first time in the current Islamic, modern Islamic history, the right and the force walk hand in hand without confrontation, despite the the contradiction that fragments the current Islamic societies. So this is the first time that the modern Islam plans and implements and be prepared against the enemy. This is some a part of this work. I find it very valuable. In the next point, the Islamic movement from 1989 to 2019, it is 30 years. We can divide it into 10 years groups, 10-year groups, 10 years, so to speak. The first point in the beginning of the reign of the Salvation government after a coup in 1989, it was the clear thing for people. It was that it is a unified movement, and there was agreement between the civilian leadership and the military leadership. But the differences or the disputes that happened, it didn't happen at a later stage, like towards the end of the 90s or in the beginning of the 2000s. But the conflict within the Islamic movement was hidden, and in the beginning of the revolution, there were power centers that were being established within the movement. That led later to this breakup that happened. I believe that the main reason for the beginning of this breakup that happened in the Islamic movement is that this experience was affected by two school of thoughts for approaches. One of them was the military one, and the other one was of the Dawah Muslims approach. And when I'm speaking about the military, I don't mean those who are affiliated with the military or who are wearing the uniform. Within the civilians in the Islamic movement, there are a number of leaders who have a mental or a military mentality. So their leadership has either overlooked or didn't see those people. So maybe they didn't notice that the military institution has its own influence, its own tradition, and its own people who were part of the Islamic movement, and that's why made the young people go in or divide into two groups.
هذا الحكم تم السيطرة عليه بطريقة القوة يظل كما هو يعني يحكم الناس عند القوة يعني. عشان كده احنا كنا أمام
That's why we faced two different or two contradicting school of thoughts since the beginning. According to the plan of the Islamic movement, in the early years, for 3 years, they were using the power, and this was coming from a certain philosophy which was coming from the divine willingness that you are a free person, so you can do whatever you want. There was opposition to that mentality. There were some military personnel who were against that mentality. Maybe they had good intentions because that this might create problems, or people will not agree on that issue. But these were the justifications that were provided. But I believe that even in the education of those people who is based on the military or strength, This will make the Islamic movement within Sudan lose this the power that they got through the use of force. This military approach within the Islamic movement made a current within the movement. The most important reasons that led people to think about or to go into that current in the beginning, Sheikh Hassan was well respected, but there was a kind of a conflict between the military leaders and the civilian leaders within the movement, and that led to the imprisonment of Sheikh Hassan al-Turabi in his first time. What we are saying is that the decision of dissolving the organization might lead to that the current that is leading to the military and to the security grip over the country was the one that will be overwhelming. Then there was another approach which was opening the space for the young people to be trained militarily, and that was because the majority of the leadership in the Islamic movement was inclined towards military thinking rather than the civilian thinking. What happened due to that? The idea that was made to give freedoms for others and give the power back to the people. There was insistence from the military aspect or the military side not to do that, and in one of the meetings of the Shura Council, the president came with the military uniform, which means that he was insisted on that kind of thinking. There was a current that was led by the Secretary General of the Islamic Movement, and another one that was led by the president, and he was because the state was in its beginning, and that if they were open to these things, it might affect the state. Then the document of the 10, maybe if that's what she said, was one of the major conjunction in the history of the Islamic movement, and a lot of people talk about that. So this memorandum, in its content, or in general, it was speaking about reforming within the organization. And the group that prepared this document, there was a problem in the preparation because it wasn't transparent. Although everything in the document was talking about the roles or the function of the Secretary General and how to divide the authority between the Secretary General and the President. This document was developed by the Shura Council, and this document was explained, or it was put as or to the side of the documents that were issued by the Islamic movement that leads to changing the centers of power within the Islamic movement. They also wanted to strengthen this document. Wanted to strengthen the position of the president at the cost of the Secretary General of the Islamic movement. All the people in the Shura Council knew And one of the things that this document focused on is that it wanted to take the authority that or the powers that were given to members from them and take them away. There is another
ما برز الى السطح الا في احداث محدده يعني الاحداث المحدده
some of the young people in the movement appeared only in certain incidents.
المؤتمر العام بتاع المؤتمر الوطني في سنه 95 اللي هو كان مرشحين فيه شخصين اللي هم من قيادات
Two members from the leadership of the Islamic movement. One of them was the sons of the from the coastal area, and one of them is from the north of Sudan. And the result was very clear. We were witnesses to this conference, and the result was for the one from the west of Sudan. But this result was forged. All of that happened before the breakup. There are, of course, here we're talking about the inside factors, but there are other external factors. Some of the things that affected and that made the Islamic movement under the attack was opening the borders of the south of Sudan and giving them space to work. That weakened the Islamic movement, and that might be some of the reasons that led to the breakup. One of the problems were the establishment of the Islamic Arab Council, because this was a threatening to the West. We can say that this breakup was not a struggle for power, but we can say that this was for the people.
This division was culminated in this Shura meeting, where the decision was made to freeze the General Secretariat, although it was only 3 months into its term. And those are the things that happened towards the end, where the Secretary General and the Secretariat were frozen, and their role was curbed, and they were surrounded by security forces, and there was the establishment of the emergency state as well, and the dissolution of the National Council, although the decision itself should have been approved by the National Council. So this was the beginning of this descent or this division. It was complete, and then gradually it surfaced. In addition, those issues that caused those divisions, the most important is the question of the freedoms, because within the Islamic movement there was this tendency to believe that freedoms are essential, and others within the Islamic movement believed that no, this is going to cause many problems. The other issue was also related to freedoms, which is that the wali or the governor of the state said can be elected by the grassroots or the people, but the other bloc thought that they better be appointed or nominated by by the local councils, and then the president of the republic would make the assignment. So, which is a hybrid process between assignment and election. Doctor, can you conclude in 2 minutes? Also the immunity of the prime minister and also the federal system, all of those things are actually interconnected. So those two blocks within the Islamic movement, one of them recognized the diversity in Sudan, and there was an issue. They thought that it was problematic to crack down on freedom of journalism and etc. So some of the consequences of this mufasala or this division was that some of the secrets were leaked, and it affected also other Islamic movements in other states because they looked up to the movement in Sudan. And the lessons learned basically is that this division was not bloody except for some of the partners who were arrested or who were dismissed. So some coercive acts, but not total bloodshed. And also, what we should learn is that those whom we put in power, no matter how good they are, should not be left in power for a long time, so that they are not, do not become authoritarian. And then one of the things that the two blocks benefited from after the division is that the people started to work with the different movements or different parties, but there was still some respect for the Islamic movement, and there was a separation between the crackdown on freedoms and the Islamic movement, which was positive, and also it opened the floor for dialogue with the grassroots and with the people. And this division was one of the most important issues that happened, and it remains to be learned from for all Islamic movements. And thank you so much. Sorry for taking so long. Thank you so much, Dr. Najwa, for this presentation. Dr. Najwa, in her presentation, talked about the division within the Islamic movement, and she said she prefers the word mufasala for reasons, because mufasala takes a long time and a gradual process, and it's not a direct or a temporary fissure, and it does not eliminate the movement as a whole, and that's true because it resulted in two separate movements 20 years on. And that in her paper also she used the analysis process or methodology, and that what happened in Sudan stands out on different levels, and she talked about 6 characteristics of the Sudanese experience, and she mentioned the peaceful phase of this division. First of all, the Islamic movement was pressuring force against leftist forces, and also the Islamic movement was not static and developed from one stage to the other, and it was generally popular and Sudanese in character, and had a leadership that's different from leaders in other movements. And it's also a movement that is concerned with the programming and the strategizing, and it's a characteristic it enjoyed for a long time. The 5th characteristic is that the Islamic movement was committed to Islamic ethics and morals, but not at the expense of material gain, and also that it was not only focused on philosophical and spiritual aspects, but also on political aspects and maintaining the unity of Sudan, even if it's decentralized. The question she tried to answer is the shift to taking up arms. Maybe one of the reasons she said was that the movement worked a lot within the ranks of the society and wanted to maintain those gains in the ranks of the community. And she said that this was the first time in which the principle was coupled with force or strength, and she focused on the first 10 years before the Mufassala or the division. And if people believe that the movement was unified before 1989, the coup, because there was a much latent disagreement, but they were reinforced later with the presence of two approaches. The first was the militarized approach, or what some would call this is what I meant, that the movement had its disagreements that were not that did not surface at the beginning. They were between two approaches, one that's militarized and wanted absolute obedience, while the others were concerned with the civil rights and liberties. And actually, even those in Islamic movements outside Sudan, when people talk about freedom, they would call it the Sudanese approach. So this is quite true, actually. And also, of course, the military approach had its own pitfalls. There was some apprehension by those who wanted to reinforce militarization in the Islamic movement, and it was most influential when Turabi was in prison, who was pro the civil rights and freedoms. And this was enhanced also with the trainings and the camps, etc. And it weakened the idea of civil rule and freedoms. After that, she mentioned a number of incidents that reinforced this division, and the memo of the 10th, which was an important milestone in the division or Mufassala, and that it was about reform, but it wasn't transparent enough. But it was meant mainly to tilt the balance of power and to weaken the powers of the Secretary General Hassan al-Turabi and to enhance the powers of Omar al-Bashir, the president. She said that some people have approached the movement only through this division, and that's why they have an imbalanced view as well. She also said that there were other issues that were a source of disagreement, such as the attempted assassination of Hosni Mubarak and the involvement in other incidents outside and inside Sudan, but she didn't elaborate a lot. But what she said is that those issues were a matter of disagreement, and she said that this division was not a struggle over power, but rather a philosophical matter of principle. And she said also that those disagreements were concerned with some practical issues, such as the implementation of the constitution, the introduction of the state of emergency, and the freedom of press, etc. And nonetheless, she says that it was a bloodless disagreement, and that no president, no matter how good they are, should be given powers for so long. Now we move to the second speaker, Dr. Fath-Al'aleem Abdel, who will speak in 20 minutes. Please stick to the time limit, because we have another comment to and we have to finish within 1 hour and 10 minutes. If possible, we will talk in this paper about the initiatives of reform within the Islamic movement. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of God, the Merciful, the Compassionate. Can you speak to the microphone, please? I thank you for inviting me to take part in this important event. I don't have a written paper. Actually, my paper is underway, as I joined the contributors to this event later, but I will contribute some general concepts about reform initiatives within the Islamic movement. And maybe it's lucky I haven't written up my paper yet, so I make use of all the contributions and the points made by my colleagues, so I complete my paper so it's ready for publication later. I start my contribution with the definition of reform initiatives. This is only for the purposes of this paper, for this research. So my definition of reform initiatives is the calls that were made by groups and personalities to evaluate the Islamic movement and to provide vigilance for its persistence and continuation. We talk about a number of topics. First of all, the foundation and establishment. One of the introductions is that when we talk about a critical review and a call for reform, those calls were there throughout the life of the Islamic movement, as it's part and parcel of the Islamic thought. And historically, there were many conferences to make ideological reviews. For example, the conference of 1969, in which we had Mr. Hassan al-Turabi and Sadiq Abdullah, and we saw the disagreement between the two groups, and there were so many reviews and so many initiatives. But under the governance, there were many memos and many calls for reform, because it was the role when they took up power was more critical, and more accountability was more important. So I will focus on those calls of reform. Those initiatives can be divided into 3 types. First are individual initiatives, which are the early writings of Muhammad Ahmad al-Makki and others, and also Abdul Qadir and others. They wrote articles in the papers criticizing the theory and practice of the Islamic movement. And although there were individual attempts, they were necessary to pave the way for later steps. The second type was the group-based initiatives, not related to a certain person, but a group of people who outlined memos or visions. For example, those who proposed the memo of the 10th, which talked about organizational issues, accountability, shura, and transparency, and said that there was a problem with those aspects and they need to be addressed by the Islamic movement, and they proposed some procedural issues to set them right. And also in the National Congress, there was another initiative that issued a memo of a political nature and mentioned that the problem was mainly political, and there is a stalemate, and that there is a single man show in political terms, and that this political arena has to be expanded for other actors as well. The third type of initiatives are the initiatives of structures such and entities such as al-Islah wal-Nahda, or reform and development, and the other about revival. And I called them this way because they started their own entities and organizations, and they took a new position that is closer to being separated from the main body of the Islamic movement. So some members, nonetheless, were members of those initiatives as well as the Islamic initiative, the Islamic movement, but they had a different organizational structure. Another form of initiatives, which may not be a formal initiative, was the intellectual or thought symposia, that dozens of which were organized in the ranks of the Islamic movement, that started to start discussions on many overall concepts and notions that have made a lot of influence on the situation at the time. So those are 4 types of initiatives that reform was introduced through. And also, the discourse of reform developed from one phase to another. The first phase, the memos would focus on a partial problem, such as the 10th memo that talked about certain procedures of organization. Also, the other talked about political arrangements, or some also talked about some problems with the state, that there is lack of accountability, etc., such as the thousands memo. But in those memos, or in those initiatives, there was no approach to the overall notions or concepts. But the other type of initiatives, such as the Sa'ihun and others, talked about a composite problem with a cultural dimension and social dimension, political dimension, as well as economic dimension. So this composite problem was addressed in those initiatives, and they wrote up those documents on along those lines. And they proposed a revival and renewal of the Islamic thought, and those initiatives were actually much more in depth and not just theoretical in nature. Also, those initiatives involved took the form of new organizations, such as the one that's called the Reform Movement, and the other that's called the Future Movement, as well as other groups that took the form of a new organizational structure with a rupture with the original Islamic movement. The fourth was the issues of reform. Those memos, as I mentioned, talked about different issues of political or thought-based nature, The first type of issues was the ideational nature, where they talked about the conceptualization of the fundamental concepts around the state, around Sharia, around Islam and modernization, and around reform, etc., and many other. And there were many discussions of those notions over the past 10 or 20 years. And also, we have issues related to politics, such as the augmentation of the role of the state and the hegemony of the security over politics. Others talked about issues related to development. And one of the weakest points of the Islamic movement was the issue of development, which was pretty weak in the Islamic movement's discourse. So those tended to establish programs away from any ideational background. The others talked about the nature of the party, which or the state, and the nature of its composition and its relation to modern state as a carrier of that state. And others talked about issues related to organizational issues related to shura and transparency and accountability. Of course, those issues were crucial. My general comment on those initiatives and their impact. First of all, these initiatives show that there was much discrepancy in vision even among the Islamic elite. And Dr. Hassan al-Turabi, as the ideational leader, but I don't only refer here to the ideology, but to the organization. So as Hassan al-Turabi wrote the fundamental writings and the organization, but the group that started the movement were in discrepancy, and they had to combine the idea of the state with their ideologies. Some see the state as an entity that's more or less a tool, or so or less the looking at the state as a tool. And this is a very naive way of looking at the state. And also there was the debate on Al-Sharia, and I mentioned that the term of Sharia and the Islamic State were the terms most discussed in Islamic circles over the past 50 years, and many political alignments and political alliances were made based on those terms. But those two, between those two concepts of the state, the three types of conceptualization by the three ideological leaders, the three schools of thought. But this is the topic that reform tackled at the beginning. And this discrepancy or disagreement gave rise to a number of blocks, so to speak, or currents within the Islamic movement. We have a modernist block. I wouldn't say they were westernized, but they were West influenced. They were influenced by the modern Western thought, and there was a fundamentalist and there was a Salafist current. So those three currents coexisted within the main body of the Islamic movement, and they all agreed on Islam being the solution and the Islamic and the state being the tool. But some people may say that those discrepancies are a healthy thing, and the presence of disagreement is something healthy. But such huge disagreements can sometimes be unhealthy because they may cause a lot of in-depth fundamental debates or polarization to create a third composite from the modernized, from Salafi and fundamental point of view. You will create a third composite and create the paradigm shift that Mr. Abdul Harun talked about yesterday by introducing a new paradigm that is a middle ground between the Overthrow points of view, but I doubt the ability to do so. The other alternative is to create sharp or fierce disagreements and drive away the people from Islamic context or Islamist context to secular context or the other context, and that's normal. I attended a lecture called the major ideological shifts, because ideologies do shifts. Historically, you have those movements that have an Islamic characteristic, as, for example, who take on also socialist aspects, or they take on other aspects. This is a matter of discussion, the outcome of those disagreements, but we are now in the processing phase, because would this lead to a new type of movement, or would it lead to sharper disagreements? This may be the most important question posed in this paper. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope I abided by the time limit. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Fath-Al'aleem Abdel. He spoke about general ideas on reform initiatives in the ranks of the Islamic movement, and he's working on a paper that he's trying to publish after he finishes working with us in this conference.
دعوات من شخصيات أو مجموعات.
Said those reform initiatives were based on individual initiatives and have different topics based on establishment, and they lived along the Islamic movement throughout its life. There were many meetings and gatherings in which many calls were made for reviews and initiatives.
There are three types of initiatives. One of them are individuals that started early on, and giving the example of authors like Hassan Makki and Abdul Wahab al-Effendi, and they are they demanded to make ideological revisions, and there were initiatives that were made by groups that were written for the reform and revolution, and they had some kind of organizational nature. They were talking about shura and accountability and transparency, and some of them were talking about issues of political nature, like the group of Ghazi Salah ad-Din that was that led at the end of the day to another group that was talking about expanding the political action. And there were initiatives that represented currents, and they were also calling for a different organizational structure and that are different from the Islamic movement with the larger political representation. And there were other initiatives that were calling for comprehensive issues and more
كل مرحلة
precise issues.
جزئي
There were
إجرائي
parts
أو
that we're talking about procedural, political, or a state within the state, and they were not about of political or deep philosophical nature. Some of them were of a complicated nature, and this kind of narrative led to the currents and parties that took the shape of initiative of structures and movements. The reform movements, as the speaker said, they took several forms. Some of the initiatives were of ideological, theoretical nature only, and some of them wanted to get into the foundational concepts, including modernity, Sharia, and the state, and some of them were of Sharia nature only. They were talking about the hegemony of politics or
سؤال
the
عن
hegemony of the some currents within
الأضعاف
the movement, or some of them were talking about development, and there were initiatives that were concerned about programs more than other issues to answer these questions, as well as the question between the state and the party, because they two concepts were new for the movement, and this is in some of these initiatives, this is something that was tackled. In his comment on the initiative, he said that from those initiatives, there were a huge difference between the members of the Sudanese Islamic movement, and there were differences between on the concept of the state that hasn't been solved, and as well as the Sharia, for example, and the Islamic notions, because there were different currents within the Islamic movement. There was a current that was affected with the modernity and the West, and another one that was, he called it a radical one, and a Salafist one. These were general namings, but when you look at these and the details, you see that there are differences. Sometimes there will be more inclining of two of these currents, which will lead to a third component or composite out of this thing. But also in some of the members of the group, the Salafist ideology was overwhelming more than the Sufi or the reformist thoughts. The next paper will be delivered by Dr. Isam Al-Shawwani, Hisham Al-Shawwani, and he is going to, it is a forward looking for the future of the Islamic movement in Sudan and lessons learned. 20 minutes. I hope you commit to it. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على رسول الكريم. I would like to thank the organizers of this session, SIGA, as well as the Center for Islamic Studies within Hamad University in Qatar, and the other center. My paper is about the question why Sudanese toppled the Islamic government. It is about evaluating the Salvation government and some signs about the future of Islamists in Sudan. For the sake of time, if we ask the question about the question that I raised in the paper, that why the Sudanese toppled the government or governance of the Islamists in Sudan, of course, this question is there, and we're trying to find an answer for that question. Can we ask this question in such a way, and if it is asked in such a way, will it reveal the nature or the reality of what has happened in 2019? I believe in this question by itself is misleading in its in methodology because it doesn't show us what's happened in 2019. If we describe or if we look at the salvation that happened that took place since 1989, it wasn't static, and its nature with the Islamic movement was went into different movements. There were internal fights between the president Omar Hassan al-Bashir and his party, the National Conference or National Congress, and the running of al-Bashir to the elections of 2020. So the salvation as a political system went into different phases, and it witnessed several experiences, some of which, the most importantly, after the peace process in 2005 and the participation of the leaders of the Sudanese opposition, including liberals and leftists, who also participated in the drafting of the constitution of 2005 that continued until 2019. So we see, in the political description, we can't find that the Salvation government was completely running throughout the lines that we have when we describe the Islamic movement. And the interests after 2011, the same Sudanese bourgeois that benefited from the government of salvation, they continued in the place. And if we look also at the political policies, we find that the salvation towards the end was similar to the governance of Abdullah Hamdouk and the forces of freedom and change. There was an attempt to normalize with the Western world and to have relations with the United States. So the value of the question in this meaning, again, why the Sudanese toppled the Islamic governance, I believe this question is misleading and it doesn't show the entire image. So what was toppled and what did the Sudanese toppled in 2014 until 2016? For us, what's happened is the explosion of the Sudanese political differences within the society. This is the first thing, and the regime was unable to reform itself. Those contradiction had an ideological shape, and it was this rise of these issues were represented by the leftists. They were against the Salvation government from 1989 till its fall. The explosion of the social and economic groups also made the government or made the revolution come in the shape of a globalized shape, and the narrative that was about the Salvation government was not objective and didn't pay justice to the experience. And because of the technology that is available, the December revolution was a Sudanese spring, similar to the Arab Spring that happened. And the Arab Spring, as a phenomenon in its core, it has a problem with the nation state, which is already problematic since the independence of all of our countries. And we can look at the Yemeni experience or model, the Libyan, the Yemeni, or the Syrian model, and it can show us this false name that is called the Arab Spring. So we can say that they toppled the nation state that they have, and this transition, let's say, it is inevitable, and it has a lot, and it is due to several reasons. So that's the point that I'm going to speak about. The second point, we need, or part of the paper talks about the experience of the salvation. And when we are evaluating, we are trying to make an objective evaluation of the experience. This salvation was part of the Sudanese political system, and how the changes that took place, and we discuss the structure of the political system in Syria. But here we are focusing on the experience of the Islamists in Sudan. And so this cannot be isolated from the political history of Sudan since it's the beginning of the state until today. The paper or this experience was similar to the experiences in the Arab world, which means that there is an ideology that takes over the states, just like the Ba'athist or the leftists in other, or the national Arabism in other Arabist in the other Arab countries. It is wrong to evaluate the salvation experience by the issue of democracy, because democracy is problematic in our region, and we cannot talk about democracy in broad terms because it is related to the economic and social heritage that we have, that is linked, that we had since the colonizers left Sudan. So talking about or using the standards of democracy are not sound standards. I believe for me the sound indicators for evaluating the salvation is the same indicators that the salvation used, which said that they want to spread Islam, and they want to liberate Sudan from the economic dependency, and after the liberating the country from the colonization, they raised up the Sudanese on the norms of Islam and the Quran. So these are the these are the principles or the indicators that we should evaluate the experience of the salvation on experience. So the Sudanese experience within this project were diverse, including the liberal or the sectarian forces or the elites of the Al-Ummah or the nation party, but there were Sudanese powers that played on the ethnic problems that are inherited from the days of the occupation, and they used them. There was an attempt to to divide Sudan since the day of the colonization. This is not a conspiracy theory, but this is something that we can see in the history of Sudan. So this is the what we inherited from the days of the colonization. This moment was the crowning of the in the 1989. It was the point that crowned the struggle of the social classes. But there were groups of the Sudanese bourgeois that was created by the colonizers. They were mostly leftist, and they were against the social groups that were inclined with the Muslims or with the Islamic, especially because they were from other classes or from the countryside. This the salvation failed to break the link between those classes and the colonizers. So we started to see new classes of rich people, and the migration from the countryside to the cities took place. but the national and the Salvation adopted a system which is capitalist in its form, but in its depth, it was a national economy. In December, and this is I'm going trying to be quick here. There are three factors that led to the fall of the government. So the first one is external, that supported the regime before its fall. Then they decided that this is time to this regime to fall. Another one, the presence of the social media that collected or brought the young people together, and this reminds us with the Arab Spring. And the third factor is the internal, and it is divided or broken down into two factors. The first one is the forces of the political forces in the within Sudan, and they're represented by the forces of freedom and the change, and the general union of laborers, and they are the first force or the first factor, or those people are in line with the globalization, and other people, the other one, were against the Islamists. So that was the peak point of toppling that regime. We have a big philosophical and historical question here about the movement and its relation to the state, etc., etc. This evaluation drives us to get into some conclusions that the renewal question is still there, and if the Islamic movement came to a place because of the calls for secularism and the separation of the state from the state, religion from the state, and that's what we called the social factor for the fall. So here, the fragmentation and the dissolve that happened was inevitable. And my point that has to do with the future of the Islamists, and we can look at it from two sides. The first one, first we can speak about political reform and political organizations, but we also, or the other side, we can talk about the Islam and its presence in general in the social life and what we need to do with that. But before I talk about the future outlook, the Islamic movement, it's very important to identify the Islamic movement. What happened for us, what we have written, the Islamic movement is the movement of resurrection and then the renewal against the Western renewal, and it is guided by the sources of Islam. So it is a distance that might increase or decrease from the inherited school of thoughts of the Islamists, whether be it Sufism or other sources, but it found popular support from the groups that didn't benefit from the secular renewal or modernization. The Islamic movement built its core principles against the Western movement or secular movement. It will have three impacts on three issues. The first one is about the unifying the Muslims and the conservative Sudanese against any external intervention, and the attempts to weaken Sudan further after the December revolution. And the other point is to find a narrative that can speaks to the youth people. And here comes the problem of the ethical and moral issues, and we have a social aspect which is very important, and this requires the Islamists to look at this class a problem as one of the factors for the current problems that we have, because as everybody knows that now the world is more materialistic and capitalist, so everything is built on classes. We have classes for education, information, health, and politics. So that might break or divide the Muslim community and make it live in contradicting principles, and might put it face to face to the principles of unity of the Ummah in general. So the young people might, the Islamic movement should go to meet with the or to incline with the poorer or the weaker classes. There are three problems that the Islamic movement should be aware of in the future. The first one is related to the problem of building elites, which means that the current movement to create a class of elites that are isolated from reality. The second problem is the liberalism, which means that the Islamic movement will be a liberal movement that is working on politics and is not communicating with the people, and that that agrees with all of the new modern principles of politics. So this might be accepted by some people and might be accepted by those who are thinking or having the ideology of the new Islam, liberal Islam, that is accepted by the West. And the third one is not the movement should not get into defending itself against the vulnerabilities or the injustices that it is being accused of. So the movement should not feel that it is required to justify itself against the revisions or the accusations that is being made to it, because what happened in this experience is not isolated from what happened to the entire Muslim Ummah. There are three aspects that we need to think about it for the future of the Islamic movement, which is renew communication with the groups, other Muslim groups, the Salafists and others in the country, because this is very important for the work with the family and the community, and there should be a program for the media and social media, traditional media and social media. Number two, there should be diversity in the Muslim groups, so the Muslim organizations should be diverse, taking into consideration that they should not fall into the trap of liberal Islam or liberalization or liberalism, sorry. And the third point is that the Muslims should not have a complex of guilt in order to get into these problems and living this problem of guilt.
The final point to conclude is to talk about thought renewal in the Islamic movement, as Hassan Turabi said, that they had to be active and not static, and if they stop moving, Muslims would be reformed or reformulated by others and other movements, and we need to reconsider the relation between the Islamic movement and the Islamic heritage, and we need to be more specialized, more academic in our approaches to reconsidering the movement. But we also have not to go into the pitfall of being too academic and hence going away from political action. So studying and considering Islamic heritage is important, as it is a rich resource, but we should not be static in our approach. And this approach caused the movement to go in to clash with the Sufist approach, and sometimes to talk about a cognitive or knowledge-based rupture between those two movements. And we need to be scientific about our approach in identifying the heritage and studying the heritage and the relation with the movement. And the other side is the relation between the Islamic movement and the West, and this is an important condition for understanding the contemporary context. Muslims today also have to understand their reality away from idealism and away from ideational concepts, because those Muslim communities have a historical presence in a particular historical context, and they have the attributed mission and the attributed duties based on understanding that context. In general, this is where the general structure of the lines along the lines I wanted to study, and the Islamic movement is not separated from the cultural and national history of Sudan and of sub-Saharan Africa, with the have all the connections with Mali and other African countries, and so our African connections should not be disregarded, as well as the connections, of course, the ideological connections with the Islamic world through the Islamic movement. Thank you so much.
تحدث هشام الشواني.
Mr. Hisham Al-Shawwani at the beginning talked about an attempt to try why Islamists were toppled, and the question was this the truth of what happened? This is actually not the truth, because the Salvation government was a political regime that went through different phases, and that it went through different phases at the level of Islamic ideology and at the level of political practice, and that the Salvation government has to be judged on the basis of its performance throughout its governance, and rather than just one point in time. Like any other structure, they had their own structures and their own policies. Particularly, for example, they had economic policies that may not have been similar to the ones that were adopted after the toppling of that government. So what have the Sudanese toppled due to the fragility of the state and its inability to reform itself, and the ideological nature that took over, and the liberal character of the revolution had a character that was unfair, and that the Arab Spring had issues with the nation state, and that the Sudanese have toppled the government, but also the modern nation state in Sudan along with it. We need a fair evaluation, a comprehensive evaluation, but to be brief about the experience of the Islamic movement rather than the rule of the government of Salvation. The relation was similar to other Arab states. It has to be judged in those standards, not by democratic standards and international practices, because that's in itself problematic, and that is hard to achieve it. So the standards have to be for example, the standards set by the movement itself, such as the revival of religiosity and the freedom of all people and their equal status, and improvement of religious education. And there were two projects in Sudan: the building of the state and the toppling of the state through tribal and sectarian fissures. And this the Salvation government inherited those conflicts that were there since the independence, which also included a conflict with the corrupt bourgeois there were three factors, which is the external, the regional, and international actors that wanted to topple the state and the army. And there is the social element or factor that was essentially the young people who reached to a point of explosion, and they led the revolution. And there was the political factor, which is an internal political forces who have no political practice, and they are anti-Islamist, but also that there was the disagreement in the ranks of the Islamic movement itself. So this question in itself gives rise to other questions, such as the relation with the state, and also he reached to a number of conclusions that saying that the relation between the religion and the state is a question that is not completely answered in this experience, and also the relation between secularism and the state and the conditions of secularization or secularism and modernization in Islamic states. And he said that there are two aspects. Whoever wants to deal with this issue through internal organizational restructuring, and others who want to deal with it from the point of view of a radical change in the way Islam changes its context. And he posed the question on how the Islamic movement would be able to address the questions of thought and ideational revival and reform. There are different aspects to that reform: cultural, political, and social. And he concluded by saying that there are three aspects or three issues for the Islamic movement: elitism, or being to fall victim to the idea of being victimized. And he said that the other Salafist and religious groups have to be connected with, and that other Islamist groups have also to be encouraged to accept their own diversity rather than subject themselves or surrender to the defense position of, and that Islam will not move forward without being mobile and being active, and that we need to move forward while avoiding the clash between the different Islamic ideologies, and also to be open to Western thought without being subservient to it. And he concluded by saying that this is the structure through which he believes the Islamic movement can become a worldwide Islamic project. Our final contribution for today, Dr. Hisham Shamsuddin, about future prospects.
السلام عليكم. صوت واضح؟
Assalamu alaikum. Can you hear me properly? I thank our brothers in the study centers.
نحن من زغنائها يعني المستمرين.
Despite the COVID-19 pandemic, we were very keen on contributing because of the importance of this topic. It's important to talk about our approach. It is a critical approach, but we know that and acknowledge that there is no total independence from the critic towards the thing that they are criticizing, but there is a sort of bias, and we need to acknowledge such a bias in political and social aspects. So this paper that I present to you is based on an affiliation to the general Islamic movement or current, which we may call in general, to get rid of any peculiarities or disagreements, which is the Islam of public life, the current that believes that Islam has a say in society, in economy, in politics, in education, and in all the issues and the arenas in which it is requested by those who are anti-Islamic to restricted to spirituality only. So this is in general what translates into our keenness on the continuation of the Islamic movement. At the same time, we are independent from political structures that emerged from the work of Islamic movement, and I'm talking about the different factions or organizations, because this organizational affiliation would curb your critical view. You fall prey to some tension as this you are part of that experience, of that ideology, and of that lifestyle, but you need to criticize it, so it's very hard to maintain independence in this case. At the same time, it's important not to tackle the Islamic movement from a cold academic perspective, to talk about what should have happened 20 or 30 years ago without giving enough heed to objective reality. So it has to be taken from people who are both well equipped in academic means or academic terms, but also in practical terms. So we should talk with a forward-looking perspective. So this experience is not a dead experience anyway. It's still it still continues, whether it continues in power or not. This seed survives in Sudan, and Islamists may choose for this tree to continue to thrive or to be pale and fragile and stop fruiting. The lessons that I would like to draw from this paper, in which I try to draw a perspective for prospects for the future. First of all, in terms of the approach, the Islamic movement, how it based its approach, and I hope that those who affiliate with the Islamic movement would not I hope that they wouldn't tell us about the writings of Hassan al-Turabi. We are talking about the consistency of the group as a whole, the sentimental consistency of the Sudanese Islamic movement, their points of view towards liberalism, Sufism, democracy, and it's not a movement that is divorced from its own leader, but let's not say that the leader had the say on their behalf as well. And also, it is a movement whose leader was put in a prison, so they were not really in charge, even totally in power. So we noticed that the Islamic movement at the beginning started with the mission of liberating the Muslim mind and the Muslim person from Western thought, and to give Islam a say in the constitution, in the social theory, and in economy and public life, not just private life and private circles. But with the passage of time, this censor might have winded down and only kept on repeating the same principles without introducing alternatives or giving answers to questions such as what is the economic Islamic system that you are proposing. Those questions are still general, but they are more detailed than just claiming that Islam would succeed in public life. Here, where the Islamic movement failed, not because they didn't have an answer, but because there were answers that were informal by thought persons here and there, but without a formal answer by the Islamic movement. And also the role of the state, we can't say there is a theory or a vision on the role of the state. You can tell that there is a disagreement on the issue of public freedoms or general freedoms, and also on the issue of Al-Shura. And was Shura supposed to be just for people to know, or for people to actually, for the leader to follow the majority vote? People would be surprised that there are some disagreements in those essential issues, actually. So the Islamic movement was surrounded by those questions by the public as well as by within its own ranks, and we started to see this when we talked about the when we studied the theoretical details in Marxist and liberal theories. We found those details and we asked the leaders of Islamic ideologues. We found them stuck in generalizations, in ideation without detail, and there is a lot of political improvisation. At the beginning, before the government of salvation, there was a strategy, and also with the salvation, there was a strategy, but the improvisation came because actions were divorced from that strategy, and those individuals, politicians, became the backbone of this movement and of this action, without reference to the social grassroots. And throughout this time, there needed to have been some heed given to educated people and intellectuals who would have helped to reach consensus on certain issues. And as we have seen, and as my colleague has just mentioned, in the younger generation in the Islamic movement, we noticed that there is, I wouldn't say oppression, but there was exclusion or negligence or marginalization of people who may be called intellectuals or educated, because some people called them just theorists and that they were divorced from reality. And those people who would discuss issues and who who are intellectuals were not really celebrated or welcomed. Many of them were repulsed from the body of the Islamic movement, and we actually have a similar experience in Al-Hayat and Al-Tajdid, as the movement did not tolerate a critical symposia on its own, within its own ranks. So this restriction caused people to stick to general ideas. So we had those jurisprudence and opinions here and there without formal position from the Islamic movement towards those details, and this led to some shadow movements, if you will, some non-religious movements that are more or less secular, and even they talk about the text of the Holy Quran. And also some of those enclaves were Salafists, whether they had their impact or not, they would betray that the Islamic movement was not did not give enough attention to intellectuals and critique.
مهيمنة على الحركة الإسلامية تحاول أن تستقي منها آرائها وأفكارها. بالطبع كانت هناك المادة الأصولية التي هي
Also, it's unfair to say that there was no scientific source for their thought. They used the law, be it the civil and Sharia law and international law, and there were other sources, and this had its own advantages because they started to realize some of the issues related to governance and politics. But law and jurisprudence are not the main source of knowledge when it comes to running a state. But in a society such as the Sudanese society, where we have ethnic identity issues, future issues, social divisions, work ethics, etc. So in such a complicated context, you cannot address all the issues given with only law and jurisprudence. There is the next to complete absence of, for example, social sciences and political sciences and philosophy. And I'm sure when I say philosophy, some people who think about who are affiliated with the Islamic movement would think that I refer to the theorization. No, that's not what I mean. What I mean in terms of philosophy is to look at the general ideas rather than the details. So this restriction of intellectuals, and I don't want to blame just the movement for restricting the intellectuals, but also the intellectuals themselves, where they took a side, or they were not very open to being involved with the Islamic movement, and this gave venue to pragmatism. So, for example, if we say who is the most important person in the student union, it was the political officer of the students' union. Who was the most important person in another organization? It was always the political aspect that was most salient, the person who would reach to their positions through rhetorical success. Those became the backbone of the organization, but those who referred to refraining from lies and refraining from and they would be called al-faqih, which al-faqih, that is meaning that they are the naive religious persons. So we had two restrictions. People or types of persons, the intellectuals and the religious people. So ultimately, and the main role was for the politicians. So we needed to be aware of the questions and of the movement of time, the passage of time. We need to move from generalization and talk about details and answer to the detailed questions, particularly with the intensive intellectual and cultural questions in the Sudanese society. So we cannot go into a new Islamist experience with just a few disciplines. We need also social sciences, philosophy, and other disciplines. We also have to agree on a collective ideology. I'm not saying that we have to be ideologues or have a dogma like Al-Mu'tazila, but the Islamic movement has to take a binding decision in terms of its position from essential questions, particularly also this includes the question of intellectuals and thinkers. This is their responsibility as well as the responsibility of the movement. This is at the level of the approach, at the level of governance and politics. As we mentioned, there was an augmentation of political aspects and of the state, and they thought that the state would do everything. So the politics was the entry point of everything. We might establish music bands for political ends. We might get intellectuals to speak in order to admire the Islamic movement for vote purposes. So this augmentation of the political aspect changed the Islamic movement into a political party that was trying to maintain power or to regain power. There are many testimonies from the leaders of the Islamic movement that would serve to prove this point. When they felt they were more inclined towards the Al-Turabi ideology, and we asked them as students why you did that. They said that reform started from the state, and we thought that Turabi would be able to reform the state, but it seems he has another project, and we were not raised up to anything else but having the state as the key to any reform. So this augmentation of the political aspect necessarily translated into the augmentation or exaggeration of the security aspect as well. If we go into the issue of politics, we have two issues. The political practice was based on conflict rather than reconciliation. This is based on the first issue of approach, which is absent from the Islamic movement's ideation, and it was filled by the Western style, which is based on political struggle. And so, and even when there was an attempt to have a political theory for the state, it was very meager because of lack of openness to other disciplines. Does that mean that the Islamic movement, when it used the Western style of political struggle, fell into the trap of secular practice in power? I say yes, which means the separation between ethics or morals from the politics. This was very clear in more than one point. Another issue that was not realized by many leaders of the movement was the question of the modern state and the trap of the modern state. As Mr. Fath-Al'aleem mentioned, this state had a special logic that wasn't understood widely among Islamists, and that this state in itself was non-religious, it was violent, it wasn't consensual, it would not accommodate for Sharia easily, and that required great theoretical understanding and innovation to accommodate for the Islamic movement. So they fell into that trap, and the Islamic movement became one of the tools of the modern state. So when we explain Islamic authoritarianism, we would say that Islamists in itself are not themselves authoritarian. They would find them consensual, or even from their social backgrounds, but it is this form of the violent state. They were stuck into its apparatus, and they followed its style. So ultimately, it's important to reposition politics in its right position as one of the disciplines rather than the backbone of the society, and that the state is not the main entry point for reform in the position of the Islamic movement, but it's one of the tools. The Islamic movement has to develop other tools independent from the state by going back to the society, and has to give society a priority. And also we have to reach answers to important questions such as the economics and modern states. And as for the social and economic aspects, we have to acknowledge that the Islamic movement could have been called one of the movements of the Sudanese society, because the Sudanese society was spoken on behalf of by some of the bourgeois or some tribal leaders. The bourgeois were educated in Western. Can you conclude in 2 minutes?
هل ممكن أن تختم في دقيقتين؟
Can you conclude in 2 minutes, sir?
كم تحتاج؟
Oh, only 2 minutes.
كم تحتاج؟ قل لي 5 دقائق. طيب معك 5 دقائق.
I'll try in 5 minutes. Okay.
بسرعة يعني.
I will try very quickly to conclude. So in social terms, this position of the Islamic movement in the power and in revolution created a barrier between them and society, and their eagerness to get to power showed them as one of the factions playing at power, and also it gave venue for corruption. So unfortunately, political corruption and political assassination is played down by many Islamists in Sudan. And this is very provocative for the general ranks of the people or the grassroots, which proves that there is psychological barriers between them and society. There is also a kind of arrogance in the ranks of the Islamic movement that made them into a clan. They have their own way of thinking. They only listen to themselves and one another, and it led to their fall, actually, and restricting the information devolved about them. You would see that many of them would deny the events of the revolution until it was not to be denied anymore. And there is also some questions about the exploitation of the urban areas to the rural areas. The areas from which the Islamists came was subject to many grievances, and the rural areas were eroding because they wanted to appease the urban areas so that they would not revolt against power. And there was also an alliance between the bourgeois and the capitalists, and actually the Islamists who came from the rural areas became part of the bourgeois. All of those issues caused the movement, as warned by Hassan al-Turabi. It became really a community within a community, or a clan of its own. So the political totalitarianism should not be played down, and we have to acknowledge the mistakes, and everybody has the right to rotate power, and the financial and political corruption has to be acknowledged and held to account in order to rearrange the relation between the movement and the people. So prospects, first of all, we need to work on all intellectual ideas in the state, politics, and society. And second, the Holy Quran has to be the center of that ideology, and to move away from fragmentation. And also, we have to agree on an in-depth analysis of the Islamic movement away from organizational fragmentation, going back to society with religion rather than pragmatically, and to understand that politics is a way to serve rather than a way to gain, and also to stop the political monster that wants now to regain control over the political arena, and also to reformulate the mentality of the Islamic movement, and to get rid also of, or to address the problem of identities and affiliations, and also to filter the ranks of the Islamic movement from elements that do not belong. I believe that the Islamic movement, if it makes those reforms, it will have a future. Then the movement will have a chance.
على هذا المحاضرة المهمة بتصوري والتي
Thank you very much for this important lecture, and I believe that you have come across most of the questions that we have in the conference. It was a critique, and that this critique is not objective because because he has a say in the, or he belongs to a group, and this group belongs to has a say in the political life and social life. He also said that this critique is independent from the current conflict that is taking place, and that he is not organized, organizationally belonging to any organization, and this might makes people at doubt if they belong to a certain organization, and that the organization or this critique is provided by people who have the knowledge in order to have an forward-looking, and that this experience is not dead, it is continuous, and it is one of the fruits of the Islamic action. There are different lessons that should be taken into consideration. First, at the level of the methodology, he talked about the collective mentality of the Islamists, and not on one person. He talked about Al-Turabi. If he was told that his opinion was so and so, and he was talking about the entire movement, whether it represents Al-Turabi or not. So if he was asked about, for example, Sufism or liberalism or secularism, there is no specific answer. And he says also that it didn't have that hegemony, neither organizationally or politically, and that the Islam has its own theory in society and economy, and he talked about that, and that he didn't see that through this experience, the Islamic mentality drawn back. And when they were asked questions about the details, so for example, in slogans, we talk about the Islamic economy, but when we get into the details, there was no answer, or there were no answers in specific issues by the leaders, but there were some answers from figures here and there that are not leaders. These questions haven't been as answered for 3 decades, and we started to see problems after knowing, and he's talking about himself and about the youth, that we started to find answers for these questions after we learned from other theories like the Marxism and other, and most of the answers provided by the Islamists were not methodological in answering these questions. He also said that there was no interest for the educated or the cultivated young people, because they were maybe threatening the status quo in the movement. So having this criticism led to have other currents with the or a lot of division within the movement and other currents outside the movements. There were some usuli currents that were studying the usul of jurisprudence and the fundamentalism or the fundamentalist issues of Islam, and they were not taking care of answering the main questions in the community. In addition, the pragmatic movements within the community also put them under question, and the question was about those who were under the matter of ethics and the principles. They started to be seen as naive or simple people that deserve pity. He is saying that the current life should have a collective Islamic mentality that doesn't exclude anyone. In terms of the question of governance and the state, so the importance of politics and the state and the capability of the movement to get or to attract the authority. The state is the tool for economic reform, and this makes the keenness to get on authority a dilemma, because the political practice in its core is based on conflict and not on reform or collectiveness. So the movement got into practice into the issue of secularism in the theory of the state that was provided by the West, which is separating the morals or the ethics from the state. This is the problem of the modern state, but he explained, Wael Halaq explained that in his book. So the problem of the Islamists that their practice was a pragmatic, secular, and not Islamic, and doesn't absorb or other Muslims, and that was the trap that they fell in. The state makes this movement and those who are upholding it the motor for them. The research is for the appropriate knowledge or finding knowledge, and that it can bring about a change in the community. And when we talked about the community aspect or the social aspect, the authority started to be a psychological barrier, and which led to a popular movement, or even sometimes the arrogance because of the continuation in authority, as well as hiding information and data from the decision makers. All of that led to the problematic issues or the problematic aspects that this authority gets into, as including, for example, the alliance between the bourgeois and the people in authority, and the political tyranny that took place, and the return of the relation, or restoring the relation with the people. The last question about the outlook vision, he said that the people in leadership and the theorizing people should put the Quran at the core of their their thinking, and the deep analysis is the one that brings should not be from the organizational entities, and there should be an limiting for the political competitiveness. And this is an attempt for reform. And he also called for the eliminating the corrupt people within the Islamic movement, because the loss will not only be within the movement, but for all of Sudan. Thank you very much, Mr. Hisham. Actually, we are too late, but I want to ask all of you to get a comment from some of the people, or some of the brothers who read the papers, and he sent his comment that we are going to show it to you. He just sent it to us, and he was afraid that because he got to the internet, but he was afraid that it will not last for long, so he sent a video for us. More, can you put the video, please?
Just one moment.
Wait a minute, Taimur. So this, the one who sent us the comment is the Professor Abdul Mukhtar, and let me introduce him to you very briefly. Professor Abdul Mukhtar Musa has a PhD in political sciences from Khartoum University in 2005, and before that a master's degree in political sciences, and economy. He became a professor and he worked in the political science department in Omdurman University. He provided a lot of training in the methodology, in the research and policy. He has more than 90 scientific work, including papers and in conferences and other peer-reviewed journals. He has more than 9 books, including the issue of the South and the challenges of the unity in Sudan. He also has a number of articles that he publishes in the local Sudanese journals and newspapers. We can start now.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم نشكر الجهات المنظمة.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I would like to thank the organizers for this opportunity, and I would like to thank them for selecting this important topic to have a critique about the Islamic movement in Sudan. The Islamic movement, I consider the Islamic movement as an independent academic, one of the political parties that was more like a political party. There were several aspects or the several parties in Sudan that were political ones in terms of the ability to continue mobilize people and continue in authority. So it is a political party from the Sheikh. Of course, the aim of this symposium is to make an analytical review in order to criticize the experience. And of course, because it continued for 30 years, I believe this period is sufficient or enough to analyze and evaluate this experience. We don't want to put it on trial from the perspective of the principles and the slogans, but through its performance in governance. But the most important point of the criticism and the analysis, I believe that those who are providing critique lack the objectivity because of their affiliation, whether political or ideological. It is true that there is some criticism that was provided that has a lot of objectivity, like Professor Hassan Makki and Professor Latif Zain Al-Abidin and a third person, I miss his name. But regardless of the justifications, the Islamic movement made a strategic mistake when it came to power through a military coup. Although the regional and international and local environment was sound for the success of this Islamic movement, but we found that in the 80s, the leftist movement started to retreat in the world. So it could have waited a little bit to come to power through elections, especially with the weakness of the less left parties and the weakness of those the democratically elected governments. But they made a grave mistake, a strategic mistake with this bad action that they have made. They could have corrected that mistake if they worked on the implementation of Islam. But in reality, they didn't apply Islam, they didn't implement democracy. On the contrary, they made a strong shake in the Sudanese society. So they made a kind of a deviation of the society of the Sudan from its natural development, because they intervened in the social mechanisms, the natural mechanisms of development of the Sudanese community, and they intervened in affecting the mechanisms of the society, but they were unable to implement the projects and shaken the society. So what they have conducted is militarizing the society, mobilizing the people, and the exclusion and the enablement of some parties, exclusion of others, created a number of crises that led to its failure in the at the end. But the Islamic movement also had an international blackmailing, and we need to put our finger on the pulse or on the main reason. So the Islamic movement was this main reason for that international blackmailing, because of sponsoring terrorists and its enmity a narrative like hosting, for example, Osama bin Laden and Carlos and others of the political Islam. So this was costly for it because they were isolated, sanctioned, and they were under a lot of pressure. There was a story that was mentioned by someone a few weeks ago on social media by a minister of one of the states minister. He was member of the Islamic movement. I believe that he resigned just before the uprising. This minister said that there was a woman whose husband died, and this woman was very exerted a lot of effort to teach her students, and one of her sons went to Al-Khartoum University, and he was in the political science department. After graduation, he was graduated with excellence. He graduated with excellence, and in some of the newspapers, he found an announcement which was in his specialty, but he was surprised that it went to another one who graduated from the University of the Humanities, English literature, from not very well-known university. So that was one of the problems that was prevalent during the rule of the Islamic movement. So this young person was surprised, and he was very upset with the government and with the state. And you can generalize this issue in so many other services and other in other departments, so that everything was controlled and by the ruling party or the ruling government. So there was a kind of devil that when people get into power, they lose themselves, they forget themselves. So this one of the problems in the Islamic movement in Sudan, and that we should tackle that point and not only beat about around the bush and forget about the main reasons. So the Islamic movement in Sudan incited the tribal problems or tribal division, and they created a lot of problems and divisions within communities because the governments of the Islamic movement politicized the society, and they ended the role of the local leaders, and things became more bloody, and there were more victims. So local societies or local communities had the problems within themselves or intra communities, and there were problems between one community and another. I agree with him that the Islamic movement created a psychological barrier between the person who is involved in the movement and the ordinary citizen or the ordinary person. And he also said that it was involved in ethnic and national crises, and they used the suppressing tool of the state, and it became a pragmatic, or they used the principles of a pragmatic and secular parties, and they use the pragmatism in a negative way. When we observe such an experience, we need to condemn it, because the paper that I mentioned didn't condemn or adopt it, because such a practices like killing, arrest of people, and torture, all of them are things that are condemned. So how can we don't condemn such a practices in an experience that the Sudanese people criticize it very obviously and very clearly when they took the uprising against it. So this Islamic movement created a lot of problems, and Islam could have solved the problem of identity question, but they didn't implement democracy. The Islamic movement didn't implement democracy, nor the Islamic Sharia, and actually they divided the army, divided the communities based on ethnic and religious backgrounds, and there were a large parametric institutions. So they created a crisis that Sudan is still suffering from. And this is one of the problems that face the flow of the revolution track after toppling the military regime of Al-Bashir. So the Islamic movement failed in managing the conflict or managing the administration. So the people, when they took to the streets in the largest peaceful revolution to the street against the Islamic movement, it means that this Islamic movement failed. So we need to focus on the question, how did it fail and why it failed? So this is the where we should start to criticize the Islamic movement in Sudan. Nagwa Abdul Latif, in her paper, The Breakup of the Islamic Movement, she said that there were different opinions about the arrival of Islamists to the to power, that they came after the memo that was raised by the military, which means the military raised the memo and it was a sign of so they got into power. I believe this is an unacceptable justification. Because there was an elected government in a place. I disagree with her with something that she quoted Al-Shanqiti, that when he said that it was a historic action where where the principles went hand in hand with the action. But here, I would say, well, I agree with her when she said that the breakup was inevitable, and there was a kind of the. Actually, this was an experience of an Islamic model that fails to represent the needs of people in governance. The paper of Hisham, I believe this paper has a problem, a methodological problem, but this is a good attempt by an Islamic young person, because as I knew that he was one of the movements, but he was talking about the they were uprising against Al-Bashir Al-Bashir regime and not the Islamic movement system, because this was Al-Bashir or the fall of the Al-Bashir. He decreased it into the person of Al-Bashir. Hisham started by identifying the Islamic orientation, but at the end of page 5, he says that the arrival of the Islamic orientation lacked organization. But I believe that he is. He is talking about a coup and a conspiracy, and not an organizational excellency. On page 6, he says that we can look at the military coup in 1989 as the failure of the democratic system, but did the Islamic movement made a successful alternative of this failed democratic system? I believe that the Islamic movement neither implemented Islam, neither implemented democracy. And he said that the most important political agreement in Sudan was of the 2005. It wasn't constitutional. It was between two parties, the Garang Southern Popular Movement and the authority in the north. So it wasn't made with the agreements of the parliament that was elected in the north or in the south or through a public referendum to ask the people of both countries. And this was ended by the separation. On page 7, he says that the Islamic movement inherited an economic system that excludes people, and I believe the exclusion or the marginalization happened after al-Bashir came to power and not before that, and that's why there were a lot of armed movements that arose in the south of Kordofan, for example, and other movements that were not armed, for example, in the west of Kordofan and in the east, as etc., etc. I disagree with him when he said that there were projects, and he said that in its collectivity, it doesn't go away from the culture in Sudan to reach a power that would happen either through elections or the revolution or the military coup. So he said that reaching power or reaching authority comes in one of these ways, and I believe this is oversimplification, and it is not acceptable to say that the Islamic movement, because this is one of the options. So they selected the coup. Why didn't they selected elections or democracy? I believe criticism should be objective, and this proves what I said in the beginning, that when there is affection or there is sympathy, it affects the ability to criticize the Islamic movement. Had the Islamic movement Islamic in genuine, it should have implemented Islam or the religion, but unfortunately, it should reconcile with itself, reconcile with others, because inside there was a conflict that reached to the level of a coup, military coup within, and they had enmity with others, whether inside Sudan or outside Sudan, and this led to inciting public opinion against Sudan, and the Sudanese people paid a large, a high cost of that. The Islamic movement's problem is not with the elite, but with the society, and they develop a lot of the people or those others, they paid a lot because of the exclusion, marginalization, torture, and detention. And so many of the Islamic or members of the Islamic movement, they paid a lot of price. So the Islamic movement would need a lot of or a huge effort in order to be accepted again by the hearts and minds of the Sudanese people. Thank you very much. I would like to thank Mr. Abdul for his speech. Of course, there is no space or ability for the speakers to answer or to comment on this criticism. But first, do we have another doctor with a comment? Is he with us? Is he with us? Okay. Our colleagues in Sudan, Khartoum, Sudan 2. Do you hear us?
الو الإخوة في الخرطوم، هل تسمعوننا؟
Colleagues in Al-Khartoum, do you hear us? Does any of the speakers want to comment? Dr. Nagwa or Fath-Al'aleem or Mr. Hisham Al-Shawwani, if they want to comment. Each of you has 4 minutes.
Can you hear me now? Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
تفضل.
طيب أنا شاكر لل
Okay, I thank so much the latest commentator. I believe there is another issue in addition to the organization. It's also related to objectivity and neutrality. If we're saying that we are not being objective because of affiliation, there are also a lack of objectivity because of the popular sentiment. It's very easy now to go into the popular anti-Islamist sentiment that is covered with the scientific claim or academic claim that's not really true, and it's based on negligence of some basic givens. For example, we cannot talk about the situation in Sudan while ignoring the geopolitical situation in Sudan, not only of the Islamic movement. We cannot talk about Sudan in general historically without taking into consideration the external factors and the geopolitical context. And how can you also separate between the issue of the political economy and the social composition of the state and talk about certain issues related to corruption and people who graduate without getting jobs, etc. This is so popular, populist sort of demand away from the academic in-depth study. And of course, there is a problem with the democratic elite, including the Islamists. And in 1969, it's a dilemma for all the elites, actually, where we had this attempted coup, and we had a coup previously in 1988, after which President Abdul took power. This is a well-known history, the history of the intervention of the military institution in Sudan. So it is a reflection of the conflict within society and within the classes. So we cannot talk about a division within the ranks of the Sudanese people and without talking about the ethnic division that is the heritage or that is the legacy of colonization, which tried to create the image of a North Islamic Sudan and a Southern Christian Sudan, and that's not true. Actually, Sudan is a third world country where ethnic divisions are due to lack of the crystallization of the national identity, but what gathers and is common among Sudanese is a lot more. So there is this augmentation or magnification of minor incidents, and whoever reads the books about Darfur would know this quite well. I believe that we have a problem right now with many academics, which is that they are trying to be politically correct, and they know that talking about the Islamic movement now in a critical, unobjective manner is quite welcome. This is what I wanted to say. Thank you so much. Dr. Najwa, are you there?
طيب لحظة واحدة دكتورة، أنا عندي أيضا ملاحظة مكتوبة سأقرأها ثم ترد
Hold on, Dr. Najwa. I have a written comment to read out also. The brother here says that in 1993, the Islamic movement was dissolved by a decision from a Shura council, and it was a wrong decision as the law entailed did not give a Shura that power, but I believe that the breakdown was due to polarization between a Turabi and the president, and the question is that the Sudanese people did not topple the government of salvation, as you mentioned, but the fall of this government of salvation is due to external, social, and internal factors, and it fell basically because of internal conflicts, and the also the one of the impacts of the breakup was the fall and the weakening of the ranks of the Islamic movement. Go ahead, Dr. Najwa. I have actually two comments on Professor Abdul Mukhtar's intervention in relation to the Islamic movement. I don't believe this is criticism, it's rather reprisal against the Islamic movement, and this is not something that's required or necessary in those academic circles. It has to be serious rather than to take vengeance against the Islamic movement. And he talked about affection having clouded our vision and being unable to criticize our own affiliation. But I don't stand in defense of the Islamic movement. But whoever knows the political arena in Sudan, you would see that no one else have been so self-critical as the Islamic movement through its young people, its members, and its elite. So we have a self-criticism that's quite serious, and I'm not saying that it's enough to evaluate the experience of the Islamic movement, but to some extent there was so much transparency and public criticism, self-criticism in the ranks of the Islamic movement. So this is this means that this affection and affiliation does not cloud our judgment. And another issue mentioned by Mr. Al-Shawwani, then who was toppled? Was it the experience of the Islamic movement? I would answer that the Islamic movement had a project for governance. They had a plan to govern Sudan, and this project was reduced to the first 10 years. So I believe that the model of the Islamic movement was at the beginning fell or ended by the end of the first decade. So we are to talk about the president or other figures who continued to take power through elections, whether they were forced or otherwise. So this government that took power in Sudan was not affiliated at the time to the Islamic movement because they surpassed the strategy or the plan. Thank you so much. This is what I wanted to say. Thank you so much, Dr. Najwa. Now I give the floor to Mr. Fath-Al'aleem Abdel if he is available and he would like to comment. Only in 4 minutes.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. لم يصوب حديث مباشر.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. I don't have a direct comment, but I would like to thank you so much and thank Siga the Sheikh Hamad Islamic Studies Center for inviting me and for this partnership among the different centers. And I call upon myself and yourselves to delve more in depth into those questions and those research questions. Now, the final thoughts by Dr. Hisham Shamsuddin, if you'd like to. You allow me, I will comment without a camera to comment on what Dr. Abdul mentioned from Al-Khartoum University. He said that I should have condemned the Islamic movement. Actually, in the paper, I said that we don't want to condemn or glorify the Islamic movement, but to try to study or consider this study. And but he said that this condemnation is essential. But this paper is not a political move and is not a political discourse that wants to glorify or otherwise condemn the Islamic movement. This paper had to be objective, or despite my affiliation and my belief in Islam in public affairs. From self-criticism point of view, condemnation may be in political discourse by political rivals through elections. This is what we have warned against. We don't want to use a cold academic view in considering the Islamic movement experience and to say what should have happened. We want to talk about the future. Academics sometimes are unable to cope or keep abreast with the dynamics of society and of the time. Please accept this critique for my fellow academics. This is the phenomenon in academic circles, except for little exceptions, a few people who are able to cope. So this paper was objective criticism, meant not to be a condemnation nor a glorification either. Thank you so much, Dr. Hisham, and I thank all of our speakers and commentators. We have spent around 12 hours over the past 2 days in examining the movement in Sudan. So in 12 hours, in considering an experience that's 30 years long, it's nothing. But this attempt is not going to stop here, but it's going to continue through reviews by all of those who studied and took part and observed this experience in order to reach to such lessons that would help next generations to understand this experience and remedy the mistakes and address the complicated problems in order to light the way forward. And I also would like to thank our partners in this symposium, the College of Islamic Studies in Hamad bin Khalifa University, in addition to a Ta'sis Center for Studies and Publications for their help and assistance and working on preparation and organization, as well as the University of Global Africa, which joined us from Khartoum, in addition to my colleagues in SIGA here in Istanbul, Yunus Akdeniz and
تيمور ابن تنفير
Taimur ibn Tanvir, who is in charge of the technical issues, and Omar and Selma and Rashid and Genghis on social media outlets. And I would like also to say to my colleagues, this is going to be the first of a series of symposia. The next is going to be on Egypt by the end of the month, and followed by a symposium on Tunisia in the middle of February, followed by another on Iran and the Islamic Revolution and the experience of the Islamic rule in Iran, and then followed by another study of the experience of the justice and development rule in Turkey, and then followed by symposia on other experiences that did not govern the state but had a political experience that is worth examining. All of those studies, which may end up as 100 pages, will be published in Arabic and English, and then we will hold a conference to consider all of those papers in the middle of next year. And thank you so much.